The high-level general debate within the framework of the United Nations General Assembly begins on this Tuesday in New York, during which global leaders are expected to touch upon a broad spectrum of national, regional and universal concerns. So what are the implications of Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelenskyy's in-person attendance? Do the world's present security challenges look to unite or divide the UN General Assembly? And simply speaking, how relevant is the annual UN gathering this year? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we explore yet again the challenges that look to dominate the UN platform this year. For more on this, I have Andres Sanchez Braun here in the studio with me. Andres, it's good to have you here.
Thanks. Always a pleasure to be here.
I also have Steven Borowiec with us. Steven, it's been a while and great to have you back.
Thank you.
Right, Andres, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is planning an in-person appearance at the UN General Assembly this year to rally greater support from the Global South for his country's cause against Russia's invasion. Now, before we address prospects of his plans, what can you tell us about the tendency of the Global South with regard to foreign policy?
Yes, this is going to be a bit of an exceptional episode because, as you know, Volodymyr Zelenskyy has barely left Ukraine since the invasion started. I think he visited the U.S. last year very briefly, and he attended a G7 meeting this year in Japan. So yes, he's going to New York, in this case, to the General Assembly, in order to, try to curry favor from the leaders of these countries, the so-called Global South, a heterogeneous group of countries from Africa, Latin America, Asia. He's going to try and do this through a speech at the General Assembly. He's going to try, maybe there will be, actually, we still don't know, a Security Council meeting called to deal with the war in Russia, but we still don't know about that. But mainly through this speech and trying to meet these leaders on a one-on-one basis. But the problem here, I think, is these Global South countries, some of them big economies, members of the so-called BRICS group. We have Brazil, we have India, we have South Africa, for instance. They so far have showed that they don't want their interests compromised if it comes to, for example, angering China or any other superpower. But in this case, Russia, most of them do still have ties with Russia. They haven't implemented sanctions or not fully implemented sanctions. Some of them haven't even condemned the Russian invasion. So it's going to be a tough sell, I think. Zelensky's going to try and do this through his so-called 10-point peace plan. And I think, as I say, hard sell. Maybe one of the points will garner some interest from some of these countries, the one related to food insecurity, the one that calls for Russia to rejoin the Black Sea Grain Initiative. But apart from that, I think it's going to be a tough sell.
Right, and staying with what Andres has just mentioned, then, Stephen, what more can you tell us about President Zelenskyy's proposal for this 10-point peace plan, I believe?
Well, as someone who thinks a lot about how to structure pieces of writing, it's really interesting how it's put together. It starts off with things that are very uncontroversial, like nuclear safety. Russia has taken over this Ukrainian nuclear plant, and then moves on to food security. And it starts off on these things that it would not be super hard to establish consensus on. And then at number 5, it says that Russia needs to give back all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. And then I think at number 7 is simply justice, which is, talking about Russia being persecuted for war crimes and there being a kind of international tribunal looking into all of the different incidents that have taken place since February 2022. So I think it makes a lot of sense for Zelenskyy to present a kind of vision for how this war could end. There are various takes on how this might come about. There are some people who suggest that in order to reach a peace agreement, Ukraine should be willing to relinquish some territory, like places that Russia has already come to control. But then the critics of that say, you cannot send the message that territorial boundaries are meaningless. You can't in any way endorse this aggression by Russia because it would incentivize Russia to do more to assert its will in its area around the former Soviet Union. So I'm interested to see what happens here, but it just does seem to me that by having all 10 of these points, these are not like baby steps. You know, you could start with something uncontroversial like food security or the grain deal that Andres referred to. But it does get to this sort of, you know, Russia and Ukraine have what IR theorists call non-overlapping positions. You know, they see the issue of territory just fundamentally differently. So I think Mr. Zelenskyy attending in person will lend a kind of urgency and a kind of authenticity to the proceedings, and it shows how seriously he takes this, that he's willing to leave his country, which he hasn't done all that much of. But I'll be interested to see just how much progress he can make on what is a very daunting issue that's dividing a lot of observers.
Right, indeed. And in the meantime, then, Andres, also aggravating concerns over conflict in Ukraine, of course, is the prospects of a potential arms deal between North Korea and Russia. First of all, then, Andres, what are the chances of Russia transferring sensitive technology to North Korea in exchange for ammunition to better support its offensive against Kyiv?
Well, despite of what we saw last week, you know, Kim Jong-un touring Russia, a very long trip, meeting Mr. Putin and in this Vostochny Cosmodrome, and Putin saying that this, you know, this will mean that there will be strengthened cooperation in the military field between the two countries. Despite all this, and also because of the fact that we don't know the details, and we probably really won't ever know what the real details are, but I'd like to think that Russia is actually going to be quite cautious when it comes to sensitive technologies. And by sensitive, I mean the ones related to weapons of mass destruction development. There's a number of reasons I think this is the case. For instance, I don't think Moscow wants its backyard to get any messier than it already is. Then Russia is also an official member of the so-called nuclear powers, and nuclear powers never try to get any other country's nuclear arsenal to get stronger. I don't think ever, nothing like that's ever happened. And then finally, even though both countries' economies are struggling, the Russian economy is still larger, and it hasn't gone through 3 years of isolation because of the pandemic. So I think Russia has more leverage in this case, and it can get away with, you know, it can receive this ammunition, which, by the way, is probably very old stockpiles, probably not very efficient. It's what experts call stupid ammunition. It's not guided. So I think it could get away with simply exchanging it for economic aid, food aid, and in the worst case scenario, let's say modernizing conventional forces assets. By conventional forces, I mean, you know, Navy, Air Force. This is, you know, North Korea's assets in these fields are really old. But when it comes to these sensitive technologies, the ones that some media, you know, reported that Russia was apparently going to transfer in exchange for ammunition. For instance, technology for nuclear-propelled submarines. If you know, North Korea gets its hands on this, it means that sooner or later it's going to develop submarines that will be able to launch ballistic missiles and will be able to go underwater for 3 to 4 months at a time. This means they're going to be able to sail all the way very close to U.S. waters, for example. Extremely dangerous. I don't think Moscow wants that. Then again, satellite technology. If North Korea does get its hands on some sophisticated Russian technology, it can help it develop or perfect, for example, multiple warhead reentry vehicles, which is the tip of a missile that will allow you to launch a simultaneous nuclear attack on several targets at a time. Extremely dangerous again. So why, for example, did this summit happen at the Cosmodrome? Well, according to what we saw, which is, you know, Kim inspecting, for example, the Soyuz or the Unga rockets or the flame pit of this Cosmodrome, the spaceport, is maybe because Russia is simply interested in launching the DPRK's satellites in this Cosmodrome, because I think, you know, they're about to finish this new spaceport and they're trying to sell it to other countries, Myanmar, Belarus. They're trying to make some money out of this operation because up until now, they were using Baikonur, the one in Kazakhstan, to launch satellites, and they couldn't make any money out of it. So I want to remain optimistic and think that this would be probably what's going to happen. But
and then,
let's see.
All right, then, Andres will take a cautious, optimistic stance on this. What about you, Steven? What are your thoughts on the possibility of an actual ammunition for advanced technology deal between North Korea and Russia?
I guess I'm taking a skeptical stance. I wonder how much of this trip was aimed at real deal making and how much of it was theater. I mean, in my email inbox every day, I receive all of the KCNA articles, and it was really kind of over the top, more than usual, just like very effusive about how Kim Jong-un was greeted in Russia and the cordiality between the two sides. I'm very skeptical that something is going to come from this where like North Korea supplies munitions to Russia that end up having a significant effect on the battlefield in Ukraine. I think the satellite angle is interesting. North Korea has conducted 2 unsuccessful attempted satellite launches this year, so perhaps there's some interesting collaboration there, and especially with the fact that satellite technology is on its face non-lethal, and so that's kind of easier to explain. I wonder how much of this is just about both countries, probably North Korea more so, but both countries symbolically showing the world that they have other options, that they have other friends, that they're not sitting at home waiting for the United States or the international community to call. They're going out and they're cultivating other partnerships, and they've got other things going on. But due to the opacity that surrounds a lot of what both of these countries do, I am again skeptical that all that much tangible will come out of this. And I think that what's more likely is that historians will look back on this trip and remember it more as a kind of symbolic gesture that got people like us talking.
Right. Hopefully you're right then. In the meantime, though, President Yoon Suk-yeol he intends to share his concerns about a potential collusion, if I may, between North Korea and Russia at the UN General Assembly. That being said, Andres, do you suppose that this particular issue concerning threats posed by North Korea here on the Korean Peninsula, does that particular issue look to unite the UN platform, or does it look to divide it?
Well, I believe there will be a united front, backing President Yoon's claims, but it will be, the usual suspects. The U.S., the EU, Japan, Australia, etc. Unfortunately, some other countries, including these so-called global South countries, might not really back these claims because, as Steven just put it, it's like we really haven't seen anything coming out of this yet, and we might never even see anything coming out of this summit. And if it does, it's gonna take time. So yeah, that said, I'm not really sure there's gonna be a strong condemnation for this alleged collusion on military terms. But that said, I do think that countries should worry about a situation in the peninsula, meaning that if finally Russia does transfer, even if it's just conventional forces, as I said, if it just contributes to modernize the North Korean army, that is very worrying because, sometimes I think that some countries do have a certain perception gap of what the situation is like in the peninsula. They just seem to think that this is just, rhetoric and fake escalation. But the truth is that we've seen an important military escalation in this region for decades, and especially in the last 2 decades when it comes to military buildup. And if Russia is going to transfer or modernize the North Korean army, that contributes to this buildup. And unfortunately, in a scenario like that, a miscalculation is always on the cards. So I think countries should pay more attention to the situation here.
Right, indeed. Moving forward, Stephen, there are some critics who claim that this particular UN General Assembly may have no relevance, as all 4 out of the 5 permanent member leaders of the UN Security Council are poised to miss the gathering this year. What are your thoughts?
I think there might be some kind of recency bias at work when we look at things like the UN General Assembly. I think it's like not, at the very least, not unprecedented that 4 out of 5 would not be there for whatever reason. Like China's usually not there, and then I'm not an expert on how things work at the UN, but I think that if you just looking at this particular one, you see there's a Ukraine issue, there's coups going on in the Sahel region of Africa, there's a crisis in Haiti, there's the bigger questions of climate change and of inequality around the world. But anybody who can find a time of contemporary human history where there were no wars and there were no crises and everything was fine, please raise your hand. I'm not aware of that ever happening. So there is, I mean, I guess the leader is skipping it. Like, one thing that we could infer that from that is that it's a demonstration of division, the division over how to address these matters. But I was just last week, I was at the G20 in India, and going into that, the consensus was that there was going to be no communique, that the leaders were not going to be able to agree on anything because of this division, because there's these big countries that see these pressing issues fundamentally differently. But there was a communique, and there was an agreement, and we can parse the wording and we can critique whether or not it was a good agreement or not. But putting that aside, I just think that there is a real, I think when countries are at the UN, it's harder for countries at the UN to be sort of openly pursuing their own self-interest. That's kind of not the purpose of the UN. The purpose of the UN is that the countries get together and they pursue some kind of collective vision of how the world is supposed to work. That's more challenging than something like the G20, where each country is kind of openly there for economic and for trade-related reasons, and it's easier to kind of come up with self-interested and more modest gains. The UN speaks very much in the language of the international rules-based order and of these big and quite meaningful ideas that nobody, that we all believe in to some extent, but nobody's able to ever pursue quite perfectly. So that's, I think, something interesting to keep in mind. I just wrote a long story about the kind of splitting of the world between countries like India, who are sort of openly self-interested, and countries like the US and South Korea and Japan, who at this moment in history are doubling down on the language of that there is a rules-based order, and that countries are supposed to follow this set of, not perfectly defined, but pretty well understood rules. So this General Assembly will be one more indication as to which direction that whole debate is going in.
Right, and talking about debate, Andres, do you suppose, we've talked about issues that look to potentially divide the UN General Assembly. What issues then are there that could perhaps unite the Assembly itself?
Well, I think right now the world's problems, well, I mean, the problems have always been there, and but I guess the implication of these problems, the implications are getting more and more global. So what we need we need a wider global consensus, I guess, and we saw this on G20, but there were some positive signs, I think. But yeah, unfortunately, fronts where we're going to see some unity, I'd like to think some of them might be, for example, the need to increase urgently aid for Libya, for example, after what happened in the city of Derna, this flooding through a huge tsunami that cost thousands of people dead. It's a torn country ruled by 2 different factions. And we have to avoid a spur of waterborne diseases that could claim like thousands of additional lives, right? Sustainable development goals, it's 7 years to 2030, and I believe only 15% of such goals are on track right now. So I'd like to think that some of the talks will have to do with increasing funding, definitely. Also, maybe COP28, the meeting that will happen in Dubai later this year, or strengthening supply chains. But aside from that, I'm not sure we'll see much consensus on much else.
Right, right. On a lighter note then, Steven, President Zelenskyy, he is poised to hold more than well over 30 bilateral summits with his counterparts from across the world at the UN General Assembly. He's seeking to, of course, rally greater support for Busan's bid to host the 2030 World Expo. That being said, what are your thoughts on Busan's prospects of hosting the event?
Well, I don't know. Is Vegas giving odds on this? I mean, there probably are. No, I don't know exactly what the prospects are. I don't really think that's like for me to say. I'm not privy to the behind the scenes. I don't know anything more about this than anybody else does. But I can just say, whatever happens, it certainly won't be for a lack of effort. I mean, the Korean government has been, I don't know how much they've invested in this, but I've been to Busan a few times this year. There's tons of advertising there, and there's you know, nowadays if you go to events in Korea that like on their face have nothing to do with the World Expo, there's usually a presentation or there's somebody speaking on this. It's a real kind of all hands on deck effort, you know, and illustrated by President Yoon having roughly 30 separate summits on the sidelines of the UN gathering. There is some strong competition from Saudi Arabia, another deep-pocketed country with a history of hosting big international events. So I'm just as interested as anybody to see. I'm going to do my objective reporter thing and say that I don't have a horse in the race, but I'm interested to see how it works out.
Right, me too, me too. Hopefully 7 years from now we'll be sitting here talking about Busan hosting the 2030 World Expo. All right, well, on that note then, Steven, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
My pleasure.
And Andres, thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks for having us here.
Right, well, on that note, we end Tuesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Join us same time tomorrow for a gauge of the economy. Thank you for now.